I'm Alex, 26 years old, and back then I was pretty broke. Like a lot of people, I used to hunt for cheap phone deals on sites like Craigslist. Early in 2010, I needed a new phone because mine was falling apart and my budget was tight. So, like anyone in a pinch, I started searching for something affordable. That's when I found the ad. iPhone 8, great condition, only $200. It sounded too good to be true, but I decided to take a shot. The message was simple. If you're interested, let me know. We can meet up. The photo was kind of blurry, but the price made me ignore the details. The communication with the seller was quick and straightforward. His name was Jason, and he said he could meet me in a secluded parking lot in a neighborhood I didn't know too well. Something felt off, but still, the deal was tempting. I was so eager to get my hands on that phone that I pushed the weird feeling growing in the back of my mind to the side. I showed up at the spot about 20 minutes later, a desolate, empty parking lot near an abandoned building. It was the kind of place you only visit if you've got a very specific reason to be there. Jason texted me that he was on his way, and not long after, he pulled up in a dirty old car that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The first thing I noticed was his stare, cold and intense, like he was sizing me up. He wasn't in a hurry, almost too calm, which made me feel even more uneasy. He was wearing a brown leather jacket, a look that seemed out of place for the area and situation. When he got out of the car, I could see he didn't look much like the photo he'd sent. It was like he was trying to look more normal, but something about him felt off. He greeted me with a wave and immediately offered me the phone in a plain box, no brand, which made me question the whole deal even more. I asked if I could check the phone more closely, and as I was inspecting it, I started noticing some weird details. The phone was in decent shape, but when I looked closer, I saw a small crack in the screen that hadn't been mentioned. Jason, on the other hand, was getting quieter and quieter, just watching me in silence while I handled the phone. When I asked about the crack, he just shrugged, like it didn't matter. But what really made me nervous was the way he was staring at me. No smile, nothing. It was like he was waiting for something, or maybe studying me. At this point, my anxiety was starting to grow, but I tried to stay calm. I pushed the thought of this being a scam out of my head and asked what the final price was, factoring in the screen defect. He stared at me for a long time, then, without answering right away, took a step closer. His presence was starting to make me feel uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain, like I was picking up on some kind of intention he wasn't letting on. That's when he gave me a forced smile and said the price didn't matter, that we'd settle everything on the spot. He started talking in a low voice, almost whispering, and that's when the discomfort turned into something more tangible. I'd heard stories about Craigslist scams, but I'd never imagined a meeting like this would be part of a scheme. The vibe, which was already off, got even more tense. He insisted that the payment had to be in cash, and when I mentioned I could transfer money via an app, he immediately declined. Something about the way he rejected it gave me chills. The feeling that I needed to get out of there was growing inside me, but like anyone, I didn't want to seem paranoid. I looked around, trying to figure out my options, but the place was empty, the lighting was weak, and the only sound I could hear was the rustling of trees in the distance. I was alone. No matter how much I tried to rationalize, everything in me was screaming to leave as quickly as possible. While I was trying to figure out how to get out without causing a scene, Jason stepped away for a moment and started rummaging through the car's back seat, like he was looking for something. My heart started racing. I didn't know what he was doing, but the thought that he might be hiding something made me feel like I was walking into a trap. My brain started working overtime trying to figure out the best way to get out. The problem was, with the car parked in a way that blocked the only exit, I didn't have much room to maneuver. For a second, he turned to me with something in his hands, a small shiny object that looked like a keychain. The tension in the air increased when he casually asked if I wanted to take a look at what he was offering, like it was part of the deal. Not knowing what to expect, I started to slowly back up, trying to keep the conversation light while keeping a closer eye on him. That's when, for just a second, I saw his gaze shift. He seemed more focused, more intense, and that made my stomach drop with fear. Something wasn't right, and I knew I needed to get out of there immediately. It was then that the phone he offered me started ringing. The ringtone was strange, muffled and sharp, almost like it wasn't a normal phone sound. It was as if someone on the other side was controlling it, someone I couldn't see. Jason, still staring at me, didn't rush to answer. Instead, he just looked at the phone, shrugged, and calmly placed it back in the box with an eerie calmness. The fact that he didn't even bother to answer the call made me feel even more uncomfortable. I knew this wasn't a normal deal. Something was seriously off. My adrenaline kicked in and my whole body was telling me to leave. Every part of me was screaming to turn around and run as fast as I could. I knew that if I stayed another second, I could end up in something much worse. With as much composure as I could muster, I started taking slow steps backward. My body was already in escape mode, trying to stay calm, but my instincts were telling me to bolt. Jason didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was just waiting for my reaction, but when I finally glanced around, I saw something that made me freeze in my tracks. From a distance, a car was parked near the entrance of the lot, with its headlights off but still visible. Something told me it wasn't there by chance. That's when he spoke again, as calmly as ever. You know, it's better to do things the right way, right? He wasn't looking at the phone or the car anymore. He was watching me, like a predator waiting for the right moment to make its final move. His words didn't make immediate sense, but I realized what he was implying. He wasn't just talking about the payment for the phone. Veiled threats disguised as casual conversation were far more terrifying than I could have imagined. Without hesitation and without giving any more explanations, I made a sharp turn and started walking quickly toward my car. Jason stood still, not moving, but his expression wasn't the same anymore. He was tense now, his eyes following every move I made with an intensity I had never seen before. When I got in my car and locked the doors, I noticed the car parked at the entrance was still there, but now its headlights were on, like someone was waiting for me to leave. My heart was pounding, and all I wanted was to get out of there as fast as I could. I started the car and sped out of the parking lot, glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure the car wasn't following me. I didn't know what was really going on, but the fear that something was still behind that situation, something I didn't understand, haunted me for days. The feeling that I had almost fallen into something much more sinister stayed in my mind. And to this day, whenever I see an ad with a price too good to be true, a strange sensation still takes over me. In the following days, I tried to forget what had happened, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I passed by empty places or isolated parking lots, the nightmare of that night came rushing back. I didn't know if Jason really wanted to harm me or if he was just trying to scare me into backing out of the deal, but one thing was certain: I had narrowly escaped. The worst part was the fact that I could never stop thinking about that mysterious call that rang on his phone. Every time I remembered that muffled sound, the fear mixed with a feeling of helplessness. What was that call? Who was behind it? I knew I'd never get answers to those questions. That night, the idea that I could have stumbled into something bigger and more dangerous never fully left me. I even tried to find more information about Jason in the ad, but curiously, the phone number and email he used were no longer available. The ad was deleted, and the feeling that it had all been a well-planned trap left me with an unease that I still can't shake. For a long time, I felt paranoid, checking the shadows in every corner and eyeing the cars that passed by me with suspicion. Each day, I became more convinced that I was involved in something deeper, something I hadn't understood that night. What bothered me most was that if I had accepted the phone and made the payment, it could have been too late to realize what was really happening. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't decided to leave so quickly. But either way, I knew that, as strange as it was, my intuition had saved me. To this day, the image of Jason and that weird meeting still lingers in my mind. I don't know what he really wanted or why he was so desperate to sell me that phone, but everything about that situation told me he was there for a reason I couldn't comprehend. Sometimes I try to rationalize the experience, thinking maybe it was just a scam, but the fear I felt was never something simple. It wasn't just about losing money, it was about what could have happened if I had stayed longer. Whenever I see a suspicious ad or meet a stranger in an isolated place, I feel that tightness in my chest, like part of me is still stuck in that parking lot. The feeling of being followed never completely went away. The scariest part is knowing that somewhere out there, Jason could still be around, with more victims to come, or maybe looking for a new person to trick. The fact that I never got an answer about what really happened that night still haunts me. And if you're reading this, trying to find some reassurance that you're safe making deals out there, remember one thing: always listen to your gut. The world isn't always what it seems. And often, the things that sound too good to be true really are. I was lucky to have gotten out of there in time, but I know not everyone is as fortunate. I won't trust ads that seem too perfect anymore, and I can't shake the feeling that I was just a pawn in a much bigger game than I realized. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, don't hesitate to leave and get help. It could be the difference between staying safe or getting caught up in something much darker. I luckily managed to escape, but I know I won't feel completely at peace until I never have to think about that meeting again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I was only 9 years old that night. The house was small, but it felt huge to me, especially when the lights were off and silence took over everything. We had just moved in to a house in the suburbs of a city up north. My parents always said it was a quiet, safe place and that we'd never have to worry about anything. But that night, things felt different. It was later than usual, the kind of night where you just feel like something's off, but you can't put your finger on it. The house was so quiet, too quiet, and the only thing I could hear were the creaks of the wooden floor. Suddenly, a muffled sound came from downstairs, followed by soft footsteps. I froze in bed, trying to process what I had just heard. I stayed there, not moving, my eyes locked on the door of my room, hoping it was just the wind or some random noise, but the footsteps didn't stop. What really scared me was the rhythm, like someone was pacing back and forth. I got out of bed, feeling a chill run down my spine. The house was pitch black, and I didn't dare turn on the lights, so in the dim light, I made my way toward the stairs. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, making everything feel even stranger. I knew my parents were in their rooms, but the sound was coming from downstairs. Curiosity got the best of me, and I crept down the stairs slowly, trying not to make a sound. When I reached the bottom, I saw a figure in the living room. It had its back to me, and I, scared and sleepy, thought it was my mom, maybe heading to the kitchen. I called her name, but got no answer. My heart started pounding. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I took a step closer to the figure, still feeling that weird sense that something wasn't right. The silhouette was motionless, facing away from me, and I stared at it more carefully. The streetlight outside was casting just enough light through the window to partially illuminate the room, creating long, distorted shadows. As I got closer, I noticed that the figure wasn't wearing the usual pajamas. There was something wrong, something that sent a wave of fear through me, freezing me in place. I called out again, this time louder, "Mom?" No answer, but the figure slightly turned its head, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't my mom. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes were locked on some distant spot, unblinking. My stomach churned. I didn't know what to do, but suddenly the figure took a step back, staring at me silently and intensely. In that moment, all I could do was stare into its eyes, almost hypnotized, but with a mix of dread and confusion. I wanted to scream, run upstairs, but I couldn't move a muscle. Then, before anything else could happen, the figure turned quickly and walked out the kitchen door, disappearing into the darkness of the house. My body finally reacted, and I bolted up the stairs, tripping on a few steps along the way. When I got to my room and locked the door, I forced myself to breathe slowly. My heart was still racing, and my mind was in complete turmoil. The fear wouldn't let go, and I had this overwhelming feeling that the night was far from over. When I finally managed to fall asleep, my eyes were shut, but my mind was still on edge. The next day, the sense of unease still lingered, but I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a nightmare. I tried to tell myself it was just something my imagination had come up with while I was half asleep. However, when I went downstairs for breakfast, I noticed something was off. The kitchen doors were slightly ajar, and I could see that the furniture was slightly moved, as if someone had been messing with it during the night. I swallowed hard, trying not to think about the figure from the night before. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked my dad, trying to sound casual. He looked at me with a puzzled expression, as if I had asked something silly, and replied, "Nobody, Probably just some random noise, nothing to worry about. But what he didn't know was that the feeling that something had been taken still hung in the air. It wasn't until a few hours later, while my dad was sorting through things in the living room, that he noticed something really odd. The corner of the kitchen window was broken. The glass was shattered, and there were muddy footprints on the carpet that led to the hallway. The tension in the air grew, and my dad started looking around more carefully. "I don't believe this," he said, looking at the disorganized items as if trying to figure out what had happened. I felt my body go cold, remembering the pale face and the empty eyes of the figure from the night before. My stomach turned when he finally said what I didn't want to hear. "Someone was here last night." I froze, his words echoing in my mind, and it wasn't until then that I realized how close I had been to danger without even knowing. My dad immediately called the police, and the tension in the house only grew as the minutes dragged on. While he explained the situation on the phone, I stood in the hallway trying to process everything that was happening. The house felt even quieter now, but the fear was there, pulsing in the walls and corners. My brother, who had been sleeping through the incident, woke up confused by all the commotion and the heavy atmosphere. When he asked what was going on, I could barely look him in the eye. I knew this would mark our family forever, but I didn't know how to tell him what had happened the night before. When the police arrived, they did a thorough search of the house, checking all the doors and windows, but as expected, they didn't find anything to suggest a physical intruder had been there. That's when I realized the figure I had seen the night before wasn't someone physically there. It was like it was something different, something I couldn't understand. I could never look at the house the same way after that night. The feeling of being watched was always there, and I had nightmares constantly about the pale figure following me through hallways and dark rooms. Sometimes when I was alone in the house, I'd hear the footsteps again, like someone was watching me from the shadows. I know it wasn't just my imagination. Something had changed that night, and even though the cops said it was just a simple break-in, I knew there was more to it, something that couldn't be explained. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened, but I've never been able to forget the look in that figure's eyes and the feeling of being watched. Something was there, in that house, and maybe it never left. I never told anyone about the feeling that stayed with me after that night. Even when life moved on and the house was sold, a part of me was still stuck in those moments. Years later, while talking to an old friend from school, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He lived in the same neighborhood back then and told me that another house a few streets away had been broken into in a similar way, with signs of a break-in but no physical traces of an intruder. When he described what had happened there, a chill ran through my body. He talked about a strange figure that showed up on the house's security cameras, looking similar to the one I had seen. That's when I realized what I had lived through that night wasn't an illusion, wasn't a nightmare, it was real. But the worst part was that I never knew what really happened in that house, or if that presence had just happened to be there. What I do know is that something was broken that night, something beyond the windows and doors, something I've never been able to understand.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
My name's Sarah, and I was 17 when this happened. It was just a regular afternoon, and my parents had gone out for an appointment. I was home alone, doing nothing special, just watching TV and passing the time. I never really worried about security at home, since we lived in a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Seattle. Nothing had ever happened around there. But that day, something felt different, like there was a shadow hanging over the house, though I couldn't figure out why. It was around 4 p.m. when I heard a knock on the door. At that moment, I thought it was odd because no one ever just showed up unannounced. I walked over to the door, and when I peeked through the peephole, I saw a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing a simple gray coat with messy hair, like she'd just run from somewhere. She looked at me with a shy smile and almost desperately asked, "Could I use your phone? My car broke down just around the corner, and I need to call a mechanic." At first, it seemed like a normal request, but there was something in her eyes that bothered me. like she was hiding something. Still, without thinking much about it, I opened the door just a little, enough for her to make the call. As soon as she stepped inside, her presence seemed to weigh on the room. It's not that I was naturally suspicious, but something felt off. The woman was acting way too jittery, like she was in a constant rush, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone or something. She grabbed the phone without saying a word and started dialing, but with every second I started feeling more uncomfortable. I couldn't explain why, but my gut was telling me I was making a mistake. Her words started to sound stranger and stranger as she spoke on the phone, almost like she was trying to make sure I didn't catch something. I wanted to tell her to leave, but I was frozen in place. When she finally hung up, she smiled and said, "Thank you so much, honey. I'll be right back." She walked out without me saying a word, but something told me not to trust her. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to her footsteps on the sidewalk, before I decided to shut the door and lock all the bolts. But before I stepped away, I peeked out the window and saw her standing by the fence, staring at the door like she was waiting for something. My heart started racing. I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore, that something was totally wrong. She was watching me. I forced myself to go back to the living room, trying to calm down, but my mind was consumed by that woman. It was like the atmosphere had shifted somehow. The house, which had once felt cozy, now felt too cold and way too quiet. I started wondering if I'd made the right choice, if I'd been naive letting a stranger in like that, out of nowhere. I knew something wasn't right, but fear kept me from thinking clearly. And that's when the door opened again. It was a soft but firm knock. Someone was there. I looked through the peephole again and saw the woman, but something was different now. She was with a man, and he seemed to be waiting for me to open the door. He wasn't saying anything, just staring at me with a strange smile on his face. It was like he knew I would recognize him. My stomach flipped. The woman looked directly at the peephole and, with the same nervous expression, said, "I forgot something inside. Could you let me grab it? My son's here to help me." The man beside her said nothing, but his posture was tense, like he was waiting for a reaction. Somehow I knew that something was very wrong here. I could feel the weight of the situation, and the fear was now tangible. My heart started racing, and the feeling of dread started to take over. I knew I couldn't open the door again. My instincts were screaming at me not to give in. But at the same time, I didn't want to be rude or seem suspicious without a reason. That's when the man spoke, his voice low and smooth. But somehow it made me feel even more uneasy. "Please, just a moment. She's really nervous and needs to grab her bag that she left inside. We don't want to cause any trouble. We just need a favor." He looked at the woman, who seemed visibly uncomfortable, but was still trying to convince me to open the door. Something in his voice, in his words, made me think it was all part of a plan, a trick to get into the house. I couldn't let that happen. The woman tried to smile again, but her smile was tight, forced. I watched her expression as she looked at the man, almost like she was giving him a signal to do something. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, or if there was a real connection between them that I wasn't picking up on. But the feeling of danger only grew stronger. Not knowing exactly what to do, I decided to wait a few more minutes to see if they'd leave, but I stayed alert to any movement they made. The silence in the house was broken by a louder, more impatient knock. The man was now knocking insistently, and I could feel the fear taking over. My mind was racing, and the only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to do something, and fast. I looked at the phone, and then at the door. The fear was so intense that I couldn't think clearly, but one thing was obvious. I needed help. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my phone and called the police. The call felt endless, and I knew time was running out. When I finally got through to the operator, I tried to explain the situation, but my voice was so shaky it sounded like I was living in a nightmare. She told me not to open the door and to wait for help. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath, hearing the constant knocking on the door. They were starting to get impatient, and the feeling that something terrible was about to happen consumed me. Then, suddenly, I heard quick footsteps down the hallway. They weren't like regular footsteps, but heavy, like someone was trying to break in through another part of the house. My blood ran cold. I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of terror intensified, and the sound of the door knocking now felt like the prelude to something much worse. The man and the woman kept knocking, but now I could hear a third voice. A low, hissing scream, like someone was trying to call me from somewhere, but in a strange way. What was that? I didn't know. I just knew I needed to hide. I ran to the back of the house, where there was a small pantry, and crouched down there, shaking with fear. The silence was broken once again, but this time by a familiar voice, one I never imagined hearing. The voice I heard was my dad's, and it made me feel a mix of relief and terror. He was back earlier than I expected. I ran to the window and saw his car parked in front of the house. When I looked at the front door, I noticed the woman and the man were leaving in a hurry. But before they disappeared from sight, the woman looked over her shoulder, and our eyes met. A chill ran down my spine. There was something empty in her eyes, like she had just given up on something. I can't explain it, but it was like she realized I knew what was going on, and then, without saying a word, she turned and walked away. The man followed her in silence, and they both disappeared around the corner. I was so relieved, but at the same time, the feeling that something was still wrong lingered. My dad came in through the door, and when he saw me, he asked what had happened. I quickly told him everything, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. He paused for a moment, then calmly told me I shouldn't have opened the door for that woman. He explained that there had been reports in our neighborhood of people trying to break into homes with the same story. He hugged me and said I did the right thing by not giving in, but the feeling that danger was still lurking didn't leave me so easily. What made me even more uneasy was that, after that day, the woman never appeared in the neighborhood again. No one else talked about her, or the man who was with her. It was like everything had been wiped away in an instant, without a trace. But I still wonder what they really wanted. Was it just an attempt to steal, or was there something darker going on? I know I might never know the truth, but the feeling of being watched, of having come so close to something terrible, still haunts me from time to time. Today, years later, I still think about that day. Some nights, with my eyes closed, I relive the sounds of the door knocking, the feeling of being watched, and that woman's stare. I don't know what would have happened if I had opened that door again, or if I'd done something differently. But one thing's for sure. That was one of the scariest moments of my life, and I'll never forget the fear I felt when I realized my home wasn't as safe as I thought it was.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.